Hello and welcome to Into Vietnam Weekend. I'm Jacquet. We will bring you comprehensive news on Vietnam's economy throughout the week, ending April the 24th, and following our major stories. Vietnam's major cities saw biggest monthly CPI growth since mid-2008. A Malaysian firm will build a $1.5 billion power plant in Vietnam. And our conversation with Olivier Jacquet, country president of Schneider Electric in Vietnam and Cambodia. But first, let's have a look at the figures of the week.
Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City in April saw the biggest consumer price index, or CPI, growth since the first chaotic 2008. The surge was mainly driven by food, transport, and fuel price hikes. The Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi reported that April CPI rocketed 3.16% and 3.28% respectively from March. The biggest price hikes were seen in transports in both cities. The figures saw 5.77% in Hanoi and 5.82% in Ho Chi Minh City. The surge resulted from two fuel price hikes of 30% over the past 2 months. At the same time, foodstuff continues dramatic price hikes of 6.19% in Ho Chi Minh City and 5.48% in Hanoi. The foodstuff and fuel price surges are blamed on the global higher demand and unrest in the Middle East and North Africa. Experts say the country's April CPI growth would likely surpass last month's 2.17%. Many forecast April would see an on-month CPI increase of some 3.2%. The government has not changed its full-year inflation target of 7% this year, but analysts say CPI will rocket by between 9.5% and 14%.
Vietnam's trade deficit hit the all-time high of $1.41 billion in March. The data were released by local customs officers on Wednesday, up from the earlier estimation of $1.12 billion by the General Statistics Office of Vietnam. The country imported $19.63 billion worth of goods, up 36.4% on year in the first quarter. Meanwhile, the country spent around $23.13 billion on imports, up 26.8% on year. The trade gap totaled $3.5 billion in the first quarter of this year, nearly equal to last year's corresponding figure of $3.6 billion. The deficit equaled 17.8% of total export revenue in this year's first quarter, much lower than 25% in the first 3 months of last year. 5 staples with export revenue of more than $1 billion included seafood, coffee, and crude oil, among others. Meanwhile, 6 staples with import value of more than $1 billion included petrol and oil, plastic materials, and steel, among others. The massive 9.3% dong devaluation in February boosted export revenue by $1.42 billion and import value by $1.65 billion in the first quarter.
Vietnam's state budget deficit is estimated at 11.465 trillion dongs in the first quarter of this year, equal to 2.6% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. The figures have recently been announced by the Ministry of Finance. The state budget revenues were 155.53 trillion dongs, while the expenditures were 154.92 trillions in the first 3 months. The biggest sources of the state budget revenues were domestic taxes and fees totaling 144.36 trillion dongs. Meanwhile, capital revenues amounted to 9.87 trillion dongs and rents 1.3 trillion dongs. Meanwhile, the government spent 36.15 trillion dongs on development projects. It also disbursed 118.775 trillion dongs for recurrent expenditures and around 12.075 trillion dongs for foreign loan payments. The government has ordered its bodies to narrow the state budget deficit to below 5% of gross domestic product this year. The reductions is part of efforts to implement Resolution 11 on stabilizing macroeconomics. The Ministry of Finance has also announced to reduce the recurrent expenditures by 10% from the full year's estimate and raise revenues by between 7 and 8% from the year's estimate.
The greenback on Thursday was quoted at between 10 and 15 dongs lower than the ceiling price at most banks. Following the trend, many major banks on Friday sold the currency at up to 55 dongs lower than the ceiling price. The State Bank of Vietnam on Friday fixed the midpoint reference dong-dollar exchange rate at 20,718 dongs per dollar and the ceiling price at 20,925 dongs. Meanwhile, the greenback was quoted at no more than 20,900 dongs for Rask at Vietcombank, Eximbank and ACB. In addition, beet prices were quoted at between 40 and 50 dongs per dollar lower than ask prices. Experts said the lower prices and wider gap showed positive foreign currency liquidity at local banks. They were attributed to the fact that Prime Minister Nguyen Tân Duc on April the 13th told the State Bank of Vietnam to consider tightening the foreign currency holdings in the banking system. The tightening is aimed to fight dollar speculation by commercial banks. Since the central bank on the same day capped the greenback deposit interest rate at 3% per annum, people have preferred selling the currency to the banks. The unofficial US dollar prices are now lower than official levels. We'll now move on to securities news. The local stock market continued to win in the trading week ending April the 22nd. Due to negative macroeconomic and business information, liquidity on Ho Chi Minh City Stock Exchange dropped to a 2-year low, while the benchmark VN Index dropped to the lowest level since early March. VN Index lost the 460 support level to close the week at 453.74 points. The benchmark went down 4.51 points, or 0.97% from the previous Friday. The average trading volume fell to an alarming level of 23.67 million shares in fund units, valued at 487 billion dongs per day, down 5% from the week before. In particular, liquidity dropped to 21 million shares in fund units, totaling 453 billion dongs on Tuesday, the lowest level over the past 2 years. On Hanoi Stock Exchange, HNX Index fell for the 10th consecutive session on Friday. The benchmark dropped 4.06 points, or 4.61% over the week to 83.92 points. The trading volume was almost the same as the figure in Ho Chi Minh City, averaging 23.76 million shares, valued at 317 billion dongs per day. Despite macroeconomic difficulties and the waning liquidity of the local market, foreign investors continue to net buy for the 5th week on Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange and the 6th week on the Northern Bourse. They net purchased a total of more than 5.6 million units, valued at nearly 134 billion dongs. Specifically, the gap was 109 billion dongs worth of shares on Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange and 24.6 billion dongs on the Northern Bourse. In the next part of the program, we will take a look at major macroeconomic and investment events during the past week.
Malaysian company Janakuasa will build a $1.5 billion power station in Vietnam to meet the country's energy needs in the coming years. Its executive chairman said the project was scheduled to be completed in 2014 in the southern province of Chau Vinh. The company would receive $1.59 billion from China's Huodian engineering company to finance the project. Besides, Janakuasa said it would contribute $1 million a year to an education fund to thank the Vietnamese government for awarding the project.
Petro Vietnam signed a more than $900 million credit agreement with 5 foreign lenders on Friday to finance a power plant project. The foreign creditors are China Development Bank, HSBC, Bank of Tokyo, Mitsubishi UFJ, Credit Suisse, and Intensa San Paulo. Vũng Áng thermal power plant invested by the Vietnamese group in the central province of Hà Tĩnh cost some $1.6 billion, 70% of which is borrowed. The plant is scheduled to start operation in July 2012. US-based system-on-chip solution provider Sigma Designs announced on Monday an agreement to establish a joint venture with Vietnam Multimedia Corporation or VTC. The joint venture, namely VietSilicon Technology Joint Stock Company, is expected to introduce 2 new products this year. Sigma Designs said the joint venture would combine proven IPTV semiconductor technology with VTC's unparalleled local content and network in Vietnam. Vietnamese-American Thịnh Trần, founder and CEO of Sigma Design, said the combination would help meet Vietnam's increasing demand for high-definition set-top boxes and smart energy solutions. Vietnam's high-tech toy manufacturer Tosi Robotics will export its products to Brazil for the first time in September. The announcement was made by the company's international PR executive after attending the Brazilian International Toy Show Abrin. It is the biggest Latin American toy exhibition held in the city of Sao Paulo from April the 13th to the 16th. She said the company signed a contract to export 70,000 products to the biggest toy distributor in Brazil, namely DTC.
The Vietnamese Ministry of Finance has licensed JJW Vietnam Life Insurance Company, a branch of Italy's leading life insurance group, Assicurazioni Generali. Wholly owned by a Generali group, the company is headquarters in Ho Chi Minh City, where a representative office opened at the end of 2009. Generali said it highly valued the untapped potentials of the Vietnamese insurance sectors, as evident by its growth rate of 22% last year. Vietnam has a low insurance coverage of 1.6% of GDP and a domestic saving ratios close to 30% of GDP. Last year, Generali's revenues from insurance operations in Asia rose by 43.6%.
The administration of Hậu Giang province has recently issued an ultimatum to Hong Kong-based Lee & Man paper manufacturing company. The warning came after the investor failed to execute their licensed paper and pulp projects in the province as scheduled. In the official letter to Lee & Man, the provincial government said the delayed project execution could damage the confidence of local residents reallocated for the project and of the local authorities. The notice required the investor to submit detailed information on the completion of the project to the authorities no later than April the 25th. The ultimatum said the investor's license would be revoked if it failed to comply with the requirement. The local administration licensed 2 projects, capitalized at a total of some $630 million by the firm to produce wrapping materials and pulp. Many people strongly protest against the projects. They say the projects may seriously damage the water resources of the Mekong Delta, which is a rice and aquatic farming hub of the country.
Vietnamese banks will stop lending gold from May 1st this year. Local media reported the information after the meeting between the State Bank of Vietnam, or SBV, and local commercial banks on Thursday. Local lenders will be given a roadmap of 2 years to stop receiving gold deposit by May 1st, 2013, as it takes time for them to ensure gold liquidity. Commercial banks were requested to propose their specific plans for the roadmap to the central bank. Local media noted that the new regulations is aimed to eventually dismiss gold as means of payment in the economy. Local media reported that the meeting did not mention any restrictions on gold transactions in the so-called black market. Unofficial regulations on stopping gold and lending activities at commercial banks is expected to be released next week.
And following is some foreign trade news. The Vietnam Food Association, or VFA, said the country is estimated to have exported 2.139 million tons of rice, worth $1.02 billion from the beginning of this year to April the 15th. In the first half of April alone, the country shipped 290,040 tons of the staple for $136.319 million. The second biggest rice exporter in the world, is forecast to export 6.6 million tons of the staple this year.
The Vietnam Coffee and Cocoa Association on April the 21st said the country's coffee export revenue is likely to exceed $2 billion this year due to high prices. Vietnamese coffee is now sold at $2,430 per ton in London. The country shipped more than 600,000 tons of the produce for $1.1 billion between October 2010 and April 2011. The association said foreign coffee businesses have increased their direct purchase volume.
The Vietnam Textile and Apparel Association said the country exported $3 billion worth of textile and garment products in the first quarter of this year, up 28% on year. The country is likely to reach its target of $13 billion export revenue of the products this year, as the export prices have surged by between 15% and 20%. But the association also voiced its concerns over higher production costs due to the input material price hike. Electricity and fuel prices have also increased since the end of February. Between 70% and 80% of the sector are projected to be domesticated by 2015. Mid-end condos have replaced high-end properties to lead the real estate market in Ho Chi Minh City. The change is predictable given the country's economic difficulties. We will take a closer look at the situation in this week's in-depth report.
Statistics shows that mid and low-end properties made up 70% of first quarter's sales and are mainly located in suburban areas. Small apartments of less than 50 square meters sell particularly well. These condos are sold at some $700 per square meter, which suits a large pool of house seekers.
Chứng là từ đầu năm 2009 đến nay thì những cái nguồn cung của căn hộ có giá vừa phải và thấp đã tăng một cách rất là nhanh. Thì hồi đầu năm 2009 thì cái số lượng căn hộ này chỉ chiếm khoảng 30 đến 40% cái tổng nguồn cung trên thị trường. Tuy nhiên là đến quý 1 năm 2010, 2011 thì cái nguồn cung của cái căn hộ giá có mức vừa phải và thấp là đã tăng lên đến chiếm 76% tổng nguồn cung ở trên thị trường sơ cấp. Và đặc biệt hơn nữa là các cái dự án mà ra sau này thì thường có cái giá thấp hơn, cái chiến lược giá thấp hơn.
Developers are now badly affected by the government's monetary tightening policy. Investors are not only lowering prices but also offering other incentives such as smaller installments.
Cái xu hướng của thị trường vẫn tập trung ở những căn hộ có giá vừa phải và giá thấp, là sẽ là cái vẫn cứ là một cái xu hướng chính ở trong năm 2011. Và theo như tôi nhận định thì cái xu hướng này cũng sẽ kéo dài qua cả năm 2012 chứ không phải là một cái xu hướng nhất thời.
Qua năm 2011 này thì người ta cũng phải đi vào cái thị trường nhà trung bình với cái giá là 12 đến 15 triệu đồng một mét vuông. Và tôi cũng khuyên là các doanh nghiệp để bán được cái sản phẩm của mình nên chia nhỏ ra căn hộ ra. Thí dụ chúng ta đã làm căn hộ là 100 mét vuông thì nên chia ra thành 2 căn 50 mét vuông chẳng hạn. Thì cái đó có thể là một lối thoát cho doanh nghiệp và nhà nước cũng phải quan tâm tới cái điều này.
Many experts forecast local real estate prices would rise between 10 and 20% in the near future due to more expensive construction materials and high interest rates. As a result, middle and low-income customers are advised to grasp the current opportunities of affordable housing.
Vietnam is suffering from chronic power shortage. Therefore, people are increasingly interested in power-saving solutions and renewable energy development. In this week's Business Talk, we will bring you our conversation with Olivier Jacquet, country president of Schneider Electric in Vietnam and Cambodia. He will tell us his views on the Vietnamese power market and the potential for developing renewable energy here.
Thank you very much for joining our program today. As you may know, your business started operation in Vietnam since 1990s. So what's about your business so far and your command of the Vietnamese power market?
Yeah, so we started in 1994, right after we finished to supply substation for the high voltage power line, which is linking Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City. And that was really a breakthrough to help equip Vietnam and help increase the electrification rate of Vietnam. Today, 97% of Vietnamese have access to electricity through the EVN grid. And what we are trying to do now that we have helped to accomplish that number by supplying electrical equipment is we are now looking into how we could help to electrify those areas which are not covered by EVN, which is remote areas in the mountains or in the islands outside of the seashore in Vietnam. We strive to supply products, equipment and solutions which enable our customer to save electricity, to save energy, to be more efficient. And I believe it's very important to do that in Vietnam because, as you know, there is a global shortage which comes in the form of power cuts very regularly, especially during the dry season when all the dams have no more water. So if everybody contributes by spending less electricity, then the shortage will be reduced.
So what do you think about the opportunities and challenges of developing renewable energy in Vietnam?
Renewable energy can be a complementary source for generating electricity. And in Vietnam, what I can see is because the number of sunny days is pretty high, especially in the central and south of Vietnam, there is a huge potential for Vietnam to find complementary source of energy. I look into the wind. Also, wind is definitely also in the south of Vietnam strong potential. You have all along the coastline some thermal wind which is blowing every day during the dry season and which can be used to generate power. I think there are other sources as well, such as biomass. Biomass most certainly has a lot of potential here. I think to develop this renewable energy, there is a need to have a clear government scheme on subsidy because the cost to produce 1 kilowatt hour on renewable is much higher than the cost from a power plant using coal or from hydropower plant or even nuclear power plant. So there really needs to be some encouragement financially to be able to develop this on a mass scale. I see today more and more people have interest to develop renewable, but more for their image. For example, buildings putting some solar panel on the roof to look like more a green building, for example. But that is for me anecdotic. If you want to have real solar power plants, solar farms generating few megawatts to the EVN grid, we need to have some subsidy in place. I would place this topic in the same field as the PPP, the public-private partnership.
My next question. What do you think about the potential of developing PPP projects in the power sector in Vietnam?
Vietnam, it is estimated that the need for infrastructure is still huge. And the prospect for the next 15 years is that at least in order to cope with the growth, Vietnam will need to invest $150 billion in infrastructure. And it's any kind of infrastructure. It can be seaport, airport, it can be power generation, any kind of infrastructure, tunnels, roads, railways. These are very costly spendings, but it's necessary for the country to grow. In a situation where there is such a high demand, PPP is a very good tool because Vietnam can utilize money coming from overseas, coming from private investor or institutional investors to speed up their project. I think the main issue in Vietnam is to render this PPP project bankable. By bankable, I mean any investor will agree to invest and spend money to develop Vietnam infrastructure, provided that they do have some return on investment later on. For example, I go to power generation. it means that there needs to be a scheduled price at which the investor could sell back electricity to EVN later on. If there is no such scheduled price showing bankability, it will be difficult for Vietnam to attract investors. I think the government realized this and is making action now by having those selected, targeted pilot projects and try to utilize them for future mass PPP projects.
Thank you for your information about the market. So what about the case of your company? Will your company have any plan to get involved in PPP projects in Vietnam?
Yeah, so we follow closely any PPP project as a supplier. So we'll not act as a major investor for PPP, but we will act as a supplier of energy management to make the investment sustainable and efficient and the most bankable as possible. So we may be involved directly in PPPs in renewable, but certainly not in investing in tunnels, roads, railways, or even power generation. So for the renewable projects, we are looking into projects at the early stage right now, which may come into execution in 2 or 3 years from now.
Once again, thank you very much for your time with us today.
Thank you.
The conversation has concluded our program this week. Thank you for watching. For comments and feedback, send us an email at intovietnam@vitv.vn or call us at 0422208288 or 0904111686. Thank you for watching and don't forget to tune in for our daily evening news.